February 1st, 1943. At 20,000 feet over the Tunisian desert, Lieutenant Harry C. Nessel leaned over the navigation chart, pencil in hand, plotting the flight path back from Tunis. Condensation fogged his oxygen mask, blurring the numbers. 17 minutes stood between them and relative safety. 17 minutes until the German fighters would no longer reach them. Fighters 12 o'clock high coming in fast. The tail gunner's voice crackled through the intercom. Wessel barely lifted his head when the sound hit. A noise he would never forget. Not an explosion, not the staccato of machine gun fire, but a sharp swoosh, followed by a violent jolt and a whump that rattled the plexiglass nose of the B-17 Flying Fortress. All American 3. Pieces of a German Messerschmitt Bf-109 tumbled past the bomber's wings. Chunks of fuselage, the canopy marked with an iron cross, spiraled toward the desert 5 miles below. The fighter had not exploded. It had collided directly with their plane. Miraculously, the B-17 stayed airborne. At that moment, no one aboard knew they were part of one of the most famous aviation incidents in history. Their bomber's tail was almost completely severed, held on by only a few metal spars and thin strips of aluminum. Photographs taken soon after would become iconic, studied by engineers and pilots for decades. By every law of aerodynamics, the plane should have crashed immediately. But First Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg Jr., gripping the control yoke with the resolve of a former Duke University halfback, kept 65,000 pounds of damaged aluminum aloft. This flight would become one of the most improbable survival stories of aerial warfare. Before dawn, the engines of All American 3 roared to life at Biskra Airfield, Algeria. The right side cyclone radials sent tremors through the desert sand. February 1st arrived clear and still. No sandstorms, minimal wind, visibility unlimited. Perfect bombing weather. Bragg inspected the plane, running his hands along its surfaces. At 25, he carried the calm confidence of someone who had proven himself repeatedly. His legendary 1938 Duke football team remained undefeated and unscored upon. That mindset, unyielding, determined, served him now in the skies. The B-17 F-5BO, serial number 4124406, had been Bragg's since August 24, 1942. He knew every rivet, every sound, every quirk of the aircraft. Built in Boeing's Seattle plant, it had crossed the Atlantic as part of Operation Bolero, the massive reinforcement of Allied air forces in Europe. Painted boldly on the nose, All American 3, the third plane to bear that name. Its predecessors had been lost in combat. Lieutenant Technical Sergeant Joe C. James at the flight engineer panel confirmed the plane was running smoothly. James, who would man the top turret once they reached enemy territory, had a mechanical intuition that separated the skilled from the exceptional. If James gave the plane a green light, it was ready. The crew represented a diverse cross-section of America. Co-pilot Second Lieutenant Godfrey Engel Jr. came from a Connecticut banking family. Navigator Harry C. Wessel had left the University of Minnesota engineering program to join the Army Air Forces. Bombardier Ralph Burbridge had earned his wings before Pearl Harbor, making him one of the most experienced men aboard despite being only 23. The enlisted crew brought specialized skills. Radio operator Staff Sergeant Paul A. Galloway handled the sensitive liaison radios that kept bomber formations connected. Waist gunners Staff Sergeants Michael Zuck and Elton Condor, the latter a last-minute replacement, checked their .50 caliber Brownings repeatedly. Staff Sergeant Sam T. Serapoulos, soon nicknamed Lonesome Sam, settled into his exposed position with calm resolve, aware of the vulnerability he faced. The 97th Bombardment Group, the first American heavy bomber unit to see combat in Europe, had flown its first mission from England on August 17, 1942. They had moved to North Africa under Operation Torch, supporting the Allied push against Axis forces. Losses were heavy. Aircraft and crews had fallen to fighters' flak, and the unforgiving math of strategic bombing, that day's target, the ports of Tunis and Bizerte, key supply hubs for Axis forces. Each ton of material reaching these ports prolonged enemy resistance. Each successful bombing brought the Allies closer to driving Axis forces from North Africa. The formation over the Mediterranean moved with precise coordination. 12 B-17s of the 414th Bombardment Squadron formed the defensive box pattern, maximizing coverage from their .50 caliber guns. All American 3 flew on the right wing of the lead aircraft, Flaming, commanded by Major Robert Coulter. Fighter escorts were grounded due to mechanical issues, leaving the bombers to rely on mutual defense. At 20,000 feet, temperatures dropped to 40-degree order. Ice formed on windows and the crew's breath froze inside oxygen masks. Heated flight suits battled the cold but often lost. Frostbite rivaled combat wounds on return flights. "Target in sight," Burbridge called out over the intercom. The ports of Tunis unfolded below, bustling with activity. Ships unloaded supplies. Trains waited on sidings, trucks moved toward the front. The Africa Corps clung to its last positions against Montgomery's 8th Army and Patton's 2nd Corps. Precision was critical. For 3 minutes, the plane held steady. No evasive maneuvers as Burbridge synchronized the Norden bomb sight with the target. This device, removed after each mission for security, used gyroscopes and mechanical calculations to determine exact bomb release points. Flak appeared, black puffs erupting around them. German 80mm anti-aircraft guns, initially anti-tank weapons, created deadly clouds of shrapnel. "Bombs away," Burbridge announced. All American 3 surged as 4,000 pounds of explosives dropped toward the port below. Below the port, explosions erupted. Warehouses were hit directly. Stored ammunition ignited in secondary blasts, and ships tilted dangerously at their moorings. It might have been their most successful strike yet. The moment of triumph was short-lived. As the formation turned west toward home, enemy fighters appeared. "Bandits too high, looks like 109s," multiple gunners reported. 2 Messerschmitt Bf-109 G4 fighters dived from the sun. German pilots knew from experience that the B-17s' defensive fire was weakest from the front. Nose guns couldn't angle low enough, and the top turret couldn't track fast, high-speed approaches. The first fighter, flown by Oberleutnant Julius Mimmerberg of 11, JG-2, temporarily attached to JG-53, known as the Ace of Spades, opened fire at 500 yards. His 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns flashed as rounds struck Flaming, the lead bomber, which shuddered under the hits. Pieces of aluminum peeled off. The second fighter, flown by Feldwebel Erich Paczia of 6-2 JG-53, targeted All-American 3. Paczia, with 16 confirmed victories, had earned the Ehrenpokal der Luftwaffe, the honor goblet for successful fighter pilots. He knew where to aim: cockpit for the pilots, engines for the bomber, wings for the fuel tanks. Yet at 300 yards, something went wrong. Paczia began a half-roll maneuver to escape under the bomber. A move he had performed dozens of times, it failed. Whether from overconfidence, target fixation, or mechanical failure, he didn't execute it properly. Ralph Burbridge later recalled, "I had him in my sights. He was coming straight at us. I could see his face through the windscreen." Then the top turret opened fire. Technical Sergeant Joe James hit the fighter's cockpit with a burst from the twin .50 caliber guns. At least one round struck Paczia. Whether he died instantly or was incapacitated, the fighter lost all conscious control. In less than 2 seconds, the Bf-109 collided with All-American 3, just beyond the waist gun positions. Its left wing cut through the bomber's fuselage, creating a diagonal gash from the base of the vertical stabilizer to the left horizontal stabilizer, which was completely severed. Navigator Harry Nussel later wrote to his brother describing the scene. "The fighter hit us with a swoosh and a bang that shook the whole ship. I looked back and couldn't believe what I saw. Daylight where there should have been airplane. The impact defied physics. The Bf-109's wing, moving at nearly 400 mph relative to the bomber, should have cut it in half. By chance, or what the crew would later call divine intervention, the wing missed the main structural spars on the right side by inches. The tail section, containing Staff Sergeant Sam Cerilis, remained attached by the bare minimum structural connection needed to control the aircraft. The German fighter disintegrated. Its wing remained partly embedded in the B-17. Engine and forward fuselage tumbled away in flames. The tail, with its yellow nose and black crosses, spun toward the desert below. Erich Paczia, born May 7, 1918, would be posthumously awarded the Ehrenpokal on March 1, 1943, unaware his death created one of aviation's most extraordinary survival stories. All-American 3's crew had no time to think about their attacker. Bragg called over the intercom, calm and controlled. "Pilot to crew, check in. Everybody okay?" The tail controls, rudder and elevator, were damaged or severed. The plane wanted to nose down into a graveyard spiral. One by one, the crew responded. Miraculously, no one had been injured in the collision. When it came to the tail gunner, there was silence. "Cerilis, Sam, you okay back there?" Still nothing. The intercom line was cut, but the waist gunners saw movement in the tail section. Cyrillus was alive, trapped in a tail section moving independently, swaying with each gust of air like a kite in a hurricane. The damage was severe. The left horizontal stabilizer was gone. Its elevator was missing. The vertical stabilizer had a massive gash at the base. The fuselage was opened from the tail gunner's position forward to just behind the waist windows. Control cables hung loose and hydraulic fluid leaked from severed lines. Lieutenant Charles Cliff Cutforth, navigator on a nearby B-17, maneuvered close enough to photograph All-American 3. The tail section was clearly offset, angled as if ready to detach. The diagonal slash in the fuselage and missing stabilizer were visible. The aircraft maintaining level flight defied physics. Co-pilot Godfrey Engel Jr. worked with Bragg, searching for control combinations to keep the plane airborne. With normal control surfaces compromised, they used the autopilot connected to the Norden bomb site for partial stability. Differential engine power, left engine stronger than the right, helped counter yaw. Every input had to be gentle. Too much force could tear the tail away. Major Coulter's voice crackled from flaming. "Can you make it home?" Bragg checked instruments. Fuel tanks full, engines running, temperatures and pressures normal. Electrical systems functional. The only problem, missing a major portion of the aircraft. In the nearly severed tail, Staff Sergeant Sam T. Cyrillus faced a life-or-death choice. He could stay in the tail section, hoping it would hold, or attempt to crawl forward to the main fuselage. The tail moved independently, sometimes several feet out of alignment. Each motion stressed the remaining connections. Any sudden move could have sent him 5 tons of aluminum to his death. Sam Cyrillus made his decision. Grabbing his chest parachute, his gear, and a jacket he had borrowed from Lieutenant Bragg, he began the most dangerous 30-foot crawl of his life. Inside the fuselage, the scene was chaos. Sunlight poured through ripped aluminum. Wind roared through gaps, tossing loose equipment, spent shell casings, and debris from the German fighter. The floor of the fuselage, never meant to bear weight without full structural support, bent alarmingly under his hands and knees. One misstep, one failure of the overstressed metal, and he would plunge 5 miles to the desert below. Waist gunner Michael Zuck watched in awe. He came crawling through that mess like it was a Sunday stroll, Zuck would recall. Calm, steady, dragging his equipment behind him. When he reached the forward section, the first thing he did was hand the jacket back to Zuck. "Make sure the skipper gets this when we land," he said. What should have been seconds of movement took nearly 10 minutes, but Sam Cyrillus had made it. Now all 10 crew members were together in the forward section, ready to bail if necessary. The bomber formation faced a tough decision. Standard procedure required leaving behind a damaged aircraft that couldn't keep pace. Slower planes made the formation more vulnerable to fighters. But the 414th Squadron wasn't about to abandon All-American 3. The formation closed around the crippled bomber, creating a protective shield with their guns. This meant more risk for them, slower speed, extended time in enemy airspace, but these men were loyal. They had trained, lived, and lost friends together in North Africa. Survival math came second to loyalty. "All-American, this is Red Leader," the formation commander radioed. "We're staying with you until you're clear of fighter range. Keep her steady." The German fighters, confronted with the tight formation and possibly low on fuel and ammo, eventually disengaged. They thought they had claimed their victories. Julius Meinberg, Paczia's wingman, survived the day despite severe burns when defensive fire ignited his oxygen system. In his post-war memoir, he claimed a B-17 kill. Partially correct. Flaming May would be lost, but All-American 3 refused to die. As the formation entered Allied-controlled airspace, other bombers peeled off, waggling their wings in salute, leaving All-American 3 to continue at reduced speed to protect its fragile structure. The flight from the target to Biskra, normally 1 hour, stretched into 90 agonizing minutes. Every turbulence or air pocket sent shudders through the plane. The tail section continued its erratic, independent movement, sometimes aligned, sometimes at impossible angles. Bragg and Engel established a rhythm, a careful dance with the damaged aircraft. Gentle pressure on the yoke, incremental throttle adjustments, constant attention. They flew by instinct, sensing what the aircraft could withstand. Flight engineer Joe James monitored the engines. Number 3 ran slightly hot, probably from debris but within limits. Oil pressure was steady, fuel consumption manageable. The Wright Cyclone radials built in factories across America by workers who would never know their impact continued their steady hum. "Navigator, how far to base?" Bragg asked. Harry Nussel had recalculated their position continuously. Damage had caused the plane to crab slightly, affecting speed and fuel, but they would reach Biskra with minimal reserves. 40 minutes remained. "Skipper, weather still clear at base," radio operator Paul Galloway reported. Biskra Tower had mobilized every emergency vehicle, ambulances, fire trucks, crash crews. The base commander personally monitored the situation. The crew went through landing preparations with mechanical precision, checking and rechecking equipment. Parachutes stayed on. If the tail failed during landing, they might have seconds to evacuate. Waist gunners Zook and Condor secured loose gear. Bombardier Burbridge secured the bomb site, following protocol even under extreme circumstances. Unknown to the crew, their survival was already making waves in the German fighter command. Pilots who had witnessed the collision filed reports, while intelligence officers struggled to explain it. The Luftwaffe, experienced with B-17s, believed they understood the bomber's limits. They had calculated that 20 hits from 20mm cannon shells were needed to guarantee destruction. Redundant systems, self-sealing tanks, and robust construction made B-17s tough to kill, but one flying with half its tail missing was beyond comprehension. Initial reports were met with skepticism. Surely the pilots had been mistaken. Perhaps the plane had crashed later out of sight. No aircraft could survive such damage. Yet multiple pilots and radar tracking confirmed All-American 3 flying after the collision. The incident forced the Luftwaffe to rethink attack tactics. General Adolf Galland later wrote about the morale effect. Seeing a flying fortress survive what should have been fatal damage demoralized young German pilots. They would expend ammunition, score hits, and watch the Americans fly home. Biskra Tower, this is All-American, 5 minutes out. Request straight-in approach, runway 27. All-American, you're cleared for immediate approach, runway 27. Emergency vehicles standing by. How many wounded? Bragg and Engel exchanged a look. By all rights, they should have been dead. Yet all 10 men were uninjured, at least from the collision. Tower, All-American, no wounded. Just need a straight approach. Structural damage only. Through the windscreen, the brown expanse of Biskra airfield emerged from the desert haze. Solid ground. Home. Safety. The most stunning sight any of them had ever seen appeared ahead. "Gear coming down," Engel called as he moved the lever. The landing gear operated on a separate hydraulic system from the control surfaces. The crew felt and heard the reassuring thump of the wheels locking into place. 3 green lights confirmed it. The gear was down and secure. "Flaps?" Engel asked. Bragg weighed the decision. Flaps would slow the plane, but changing airflow over the tail could strain the already damaged structure. "No flaps. We'll come in hot and use the full runway," he decided. The approach demanded every bit of skill Bragg had developed in hundreds of flight hours. The plane resisted, yawing, rolling, pitching down. Every correction required another, countering the aircraft's stubborn pull toward disaster. 1 mile out, then half a mile. The runway rushed toward them, wide and welcoming. Ground crews lined the taxiways, stunned as the impossible aircraft made its final approach. Some later said they could see daylight through the fuselage from a quarter-mile away. The main wheels touched the sand-swept runway at 110 mph, faster than normal, but as gently as Bragg could manage. For a moment it seemed the landing might be perfect. Then reality intervened. The tailwheel, destroyed in the collision, allowed the tail section to drop. The 65,000-pound aircraft slid along the runway in a shower of sparks and shredded aluminum. The sound was deafening, metal scraping concrete, a high-pitched shriek carrying for miles. Bragg and Engel applied the brakes, struggling to keep the plane straight. Without the tail wheel and with damaged rudder control, any deviation could trigger a violent ground loop that would have torn the aircraft apart. 100 yards, 200, 300. Finally, the plane stopped, nose tilted skyward, tail resting on the runway. For a moment, silence. Then all 10 crew members scrambled from the aircraft, assembling on the runway, staring back in disbelief. The damage was far worse than imagined. The tail hung at an impossible angle, connected by aluminum strips thinner than heavy paper. How it had survived 90 minutes of flight was incomprehensible. "No injuries, Doc," Bragg told the flight surgeon rushing over with his medical team. "We're all fine." The doctor looked between the crew and the aircraft, his expression somewhere between disbelief and awe. 3 curious ground crew members from another squadron climbed aboard to inspect the damage. Their combined weight, perhaps 500 pounds, was too much. With a grinding tear, the overstressed tail section finally separated from the fuselage, collapsing onto the runway. The men scrambled clear, white-faced, suddenly realizing how close the aircrew had been to death. Master Sergeant Hank Highland, crew chief for All-American 3, walked around the wreckage taking notes. His job: determine whether the aircraft could be repaired or should be written off. Normally this would have been obvious. No plane could survive this level of damage. But in 1943, the United States was producing B-17s at a pace that seemed impossible elsewhere. Factories in Seattle, Burbank, and Long Beach were turning out a new flying fortress every few hours, staffed by workers too old, too young, or female to serve in the military. Highland looked at the serial number painted on the tail, 412446. This plane had already survived more than any machine should endure. Perhaps she had one last miracle to give. Conventional wisdom said All-American 3 was finished. Any other Air Force would have scrapped her for parts. But the U.S. Army Air Forces had a different approach. If it could be fixed, it would be fixed. Highland and the 50th Air Service Squadron spent 6 weeks performing what amounted to major surgery on the aircraft. They found a tail section from another B-17, itself damaged in a landing accident, and grafted it onto All-American 3. Every rivet had to be exact. Every control cable carefully tensioned. Every electrical connection tested repeatedly. They worked under desert heat reaching 120 degree F and in freezing desert nights. Every repaired aircraft meant one more bomber against the enemy, one step closer to victory. The repair was crude by Boeing factory standards. The plane would be slower, less responsive, and prone to new vibrations. Yet on May 10, 1943, All-American 3 flew again, carrying a fresh crew on a mission to Sicily. Ground crews watched her take off with pride and apprehension. She held together. From then on, she flew less dangerous missions, training, transport, or low-risk runs, earning a quieter life after surviving the impossible. On March 6, 1945, at Lusaira Airfield in Italy, she was finally retired and salvaged, her war complete. Research into the German pilot who collided with All-American 3 paints a stark picture. Feldwebel Erich Paczia was 24 on February 1, 1943, just a year younger than Kendrick Bragg. Born May 7, 1918, he grew up in a Germany reshaped by National Socialism, trained in glider clubs secretly preparing pilots for the Luftwaffe, despite the Treaty of Versailles. By early 1943, Paczia had proven himself an exceptional fighter pilot. 16 confirmed victories placed him among the skilled, though not legendary, Luftwaffe aces, men who did their job professionally, but without fame. He flew with 6 JG-53, one of the Luftwaffe's most successful fighter wings, credited with over 4,000 Allied aircraft destroyed. His Bf-109 G4 represented the latest iteration of Willy Messerschmitt's design, powered by a Daimler-Benz DB605 engine producing 1,475 horsepower, armed with a 20mm cannon through the propeller hub and 2 13mm nose machine guns. In skilled hands, it should have been more than a match for a lumbering B-17, but aerial combat is unforgiving. A single moment of inattention, a single round in the wrong spot, and experience becomes irrelevant. Technical Sergeant Joe James's twin, 50 caliber guns struck their mark, ending Erich Paczia's life instantly. His body was recovered from the wreckage of his fighter and interred at Bourges Cedria German War Cemetery in Benarouz, Tunisia, where it remains today. Plot 3, Row 8, Grave 15. On March 1, 1943, Paczia was posthumously awarded the Ehrenpokal der Luftwaffe, the honor goblet recognizing his service as a fighter pilot. The citation made no mention of the collision, only noting that he had died in aerial combat against enemy bombers. His family received the formal letter from his commanding officer, praising his service to the Reich, never knowing that their son's death had produced one of the most extraordinary survival stories in aviation history. The survival of All-American 3 became a major study for Boeing engineers and Army Air Force analysts. How had a B-17 missing critical structural components remained airborne for 90 minutes? The answer lay in the bomber's revolutionary design. Unlike earlier aircraft that relied on a single main spar through the wings and fuselage, the B-17 used semi-monocoque construction. Strength came from the entire structure working together. The aluminum skin carried load, reinforced by frames and stringers distributing stress throughout the airframe. When primary paths failed, secondary or even tertiary paths could carry enough load to keep the aircraft intact. The key to All-American 3's survival was what remained intact. The wing-to-fuselage junction, the strongest point, was untouched. Main wing spars supporting 4 engines and fuel tanks were undamaged. The bomb bay, designed to carry up to 8,000 pounds of ordnance, acted as a rigid box holding forward and aft sections together even when surrounding structures failed. Boeing engineer William Allen reviewed the incident, noting that the B-17 was designed with combat damage in mind. "We knew these aircraft would take hits," he wrote. Redundancy was built in. Multiple control cables, backup hydraulics, and structural members capable of carrying load when others failed. The survival of this aircraft proves every extra pound of structure was necessary. The electrical system also played a critical role. While mechanical control cables were severed, electrical lines to the autopilot servos remained partially functional. This allowed Bragg and Engel to retain some control through the Norden bombsight autopilot, a use it was not intended for, but invaluable under the circumstances. The flight of All-American 3 sent waves through both Allied and Axis forces. For American crews, it became a morale-boosting legend, told from England to Italy. If a bomber could survive half its tail being shot off, other damaged aircraft could make it home too. The psychological effect was immense. Crews gained confidence knowing their flying fortresses could absorb hits that would destroy other bombers. The 414th Bombardment Squadron adopted a new emblem inspired by the incident, a puppy praying atop a plane's tail section, referencing the phrase, "coming in on a wing and a prayer." Though the famous song of the same title was about another aircraft, the association with All-American 3 became permanent in squadron lore. For the Germans, the story reinforced concerns about American industrial power. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, responsible for Luftwaffe production, warned fighter commanders, "The Americans are building bombers like we build cars. No, faster than cars. And these bombers are not fragile. They are flying tanks." Tactically, the implications were serious. Luftwaffe doctrine assumed catastrophic structural damage would destroy a bomber. Pilots were trained to hit critical points, wing routes, cockpits, bomb bays where cannon shells should be fatal. All-American 3 proved that even perfect shots might fail. Major Gerhard Rall, who would become the third highest scoring ace with 275 victories, described the frustration. "You'd attack, score hits, see pieces fly, and the bomber kept flying. You attacked again, spent all ammo, still it flew. Sometimes you wondered if American bombers had supernatural protection." German tactics adapted, attacks from the front where defenses were weakest. Multiple fighters on one bomber, and heavier weapons like the 30mm Mk108 cannon, capable of creating meter-wide holes in bomber structures. The 10 men who survived All-American 3 carried that experience for life. First Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg Jr. finished his tour, returned to the U.S. and became an instructor pilot, teaching skills that might one day save others. He rarely spoke of February 1, 1943, telling family simply, "We were lucky. Good airplane, good crew, lucky." He died October 13, 1999. At 81, navigator Harry C. Nussel's letter home, written days after the incident and signed by all 10 crew members, provides a contemporary account. "I still can't believe we made it. When I looked back and saw daylight through the airplane, I thought we were finished. But Bragg and Engel kept her flying. I don't know how, but they did." Nussel died June 27, 1991 at 74. Bombardier Ralph Burbridge became the unofficial historian, spending decades correcting myths. No parachute cords held the plane together. The bomb run had occurred on the way home, not toward England. The true story, he insisted, was remarkable enough. He died February 3, 2013 at 92, one of the last living witnesses to that day over Tunisia. Co-pilot Godfrey Engel Jr. returned to Connecticut, rarely speaking of his service, sometimes moving his hands as if controlling an aircraft during storms. He died May 3, 2007 at 92. Technical Sergeant Joe James, whose fire had killed Paczia and triggered the collision, struggled with the paradox of his role, saving the crew while inadvertently almost causing their deaths. "I did my job," he said. "That's all any of us did." Waist gunners Michael Zook and Elton Condor recalled that watching Sam Sarilas crawl through the destroyed fuselage was the bravest act they saw in the war. "We saw many brave men do brave things," Zook said in a 1985 interview. But Sam crawling through that mess, calm as could be, that was something special. Staff Sergeant Sam T. Cerilis, Lonesome Sam, who had ridden the severed tail section, became a legend in the Army Air Forces. His calm, matter-of-fact courage, shown even in small acts like returning Bragg's jacket, reflected the unshakable determination typical of the best American air crews. "What else was I going to do?" Staff Sergeant Sam T. Cerilis said when asked about crawling through the damaged fuselage. "Sit there and wait to fall out of the sky? Better to try and survive than wait to die." Radio operator Paul Galloway would later describe keeping in contact with base during the return flight as one of the most difficult tasks of his life. "Every time the plane lurched, I thought we were coming apart," he recalled. "But I kept transmitting our position, keeping my voice steady. If we went down, I wanted them to know where to find us." The photograph taken by Lieutenant Charles Cliff Cutforth from the Flying Flit gun became one of World War II's most analyzed images. Catalogued as U.S. Air Force Photo 05524 F1234 P01 it captures All-American 3 in profile against the North African desert, her tail damage clearly visible. Engineers, pilots, and historians would study this image for decades, searching for clues about the improbable survival. The photo shows devastating damage and near miraculous survival. The left horizontal stabilizer is entirely gone. The vertical stabilizer bears a massive diagonal gash, and the fuselage is open from the tail gunner's position forward. Yet all 4 engines are running, and the aircraft maintains level flight, defying physics as most would expect. Over the years, the photograph has been misattributed and misrepresented. Some claimed it showed the aircraft over the English Channel escorted by P-51 Mustangs. Others said it was taken from a German fighter. Certain versions were doctored to exaggerate the damage, but the original image needed no enhancement. It shows what 10 men achieved through skill, determination, and what many would call divine intervention. The February 1, 1943 incident occurred during a pivotal point in the North African campaign. The Afrika Korps, once seen as invincible under Erwin Rommel, was being squeezed by Montgomery's 8th Army from the east and American forces pushing from the west. The port facilities at Tunis and Bizerte, the day's mission targets, were vital for Axis supply lines. Each successful bombing run sped the collapse of German defenses. Within 3 months of all American 3's return, Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. On May 13, 1943, nearly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers capitulated in Tunisia, a defeat comparable in strategic impact to Stalingrad. The 97th Bombardment Group, including the repaired All-American 3, played a role in this victory. The B-17 Flying Fortress would become the most iconic American bomber of World War II. Though the B-24 Liberator carried more bombs over longer distances, it was the B-17 that captured the public imagination. Its resilience and ability to bring crews home became legendary. By the war's end, B-17s had dropped 36 tons of bombs on European targets, more than any other American aircraft. The cost, however, was heavy. Of 12,731 B-17s produced, 4,735 were lost in combat, each loss representing 10 men who would never return home. Bomber crews faced one of the lowest survival rates in the military, and completing a 25-mission tour, later increased to 35, was considered beating the odds. The miracle of All-American 3 stood in stark contrast to the brutal statistics of strategic bombing. Aviation engineers analyzing the incident concluded the aircraft had operated at the extreme margins of controllability. The center of gravity had shifted far aft due to the missing tail, creating conditions that would challenge even modern flight control systems. Survival depended on several key factors. Structural redundancy. The B-17's design included multiple load paths. When primary structures failed, secondary systems not designed for full load managed to maintain enough integrity to keep the aircraft flying. Speed reduction. Bragg immediately slowed the aircraft, minimizing aerodynamic forces that could tear the airframe apart. Every mile per hour slower decreased stress on the damaged structure exponentially. Gentle control inputs. Bragg and Engel's careful, coordinated movements ensured the remaining structure was not overstressed. Aggressive inputs would have exceeded the airframe's limits. Weight distribution. The crew's movement forward from the tail helped shift the center of gravity, partially compensating for the missing tail weight. Environmental factors. The relatively smooth air over the North African desert prevented additional stress. Severe turbulence or thunderstorms would likely have destroyed the aircraft. The engineering community continues to study the incident as a case of robust design combined with exceptional piloting. Lessons learned influenced post-war aircraft design, especially in structural redundancy and combat damage tolerance. From the German perspective, Erich Paczia's death was recorded precisely in the JG-53 war diary. Feldwebel Paczia failed to return from combat mission against American bomber formation. Witnessed colliding with enemy aircraft by Leutnant Meimerberg. Aircraft and pilot lost. What the records do not show is the morale impact. Young pilots, many with under 100 flight hours, expected B-17s to be slow, vulnerable targets. Then they would attack and watch these bombers absorb severe damage and still fly. Oberstleutnant Egon Meyer, developer of the Luftwaffe's head-on bomber attack tactic, noted, "The American bombers were not what we expected. We expected fragile aircraft needing fighter escort. Instead, we found flying fortresses that could survive damage we thought impossible." The Luftwaffe began keeping detailed records on B-17 survivability, searching for weak points. Even when catastrophic damage occurred, B-17s often reached base, prompting development of heavier weaponry, including rockets and 30mm cannons aimed at destroying bombers. At Boeing in Seattle, news of All-American 3's survival was met with quiet pride. Engineers and factory workers who built aircraft 41-24406 had never met the crew, yet they felt a connection. Every rivet, wire, and system tested had contributed to bringing 10 men home. The B-17 design had begun in 1934 with the Army Air Corps' requirement for a multi-engine bomber. The Model 299, first flown July 28, 1935, prioritized survivability. Multiple engines capable of flying if one or two failed, redundant controls, self-sealing fuel tanks, and armor around critical systems. Yet All-American 3 exceeded even Boeing's expectations. The company used the incident in training materials to emphasize the importance of redundancy and over-engineering. "Build it stronger than it needs to be" became an unofficial motto, because someday a life could depend on that extra strength. The production of B-17s remained extraordinary. At peak, Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed Vega were completing 16 B-17s every day. The workforce behind the B-17 program included thousands of women, Rosie the Riveters, many of whom had never set foot in a manufacturing plant before the war. Yet their workmanship met quality standards that would challenge even today's computer-controlled machinery. Over the years, the story of All-American 3 has grown with layers of myth and exaggeration. Retellings have added dramatic elements that never happened. The crew supposedly using parachute cords to hold the plane together, completing their bombing run after the collision, flying all the way to England, or the tail gunner being rescued mid-air. While exciting, these embellishments actually dilute the true achievement. The reality, backed by contemporary documents, crew testimony, and photographic evidence, is remarkable enough. 10 men flew a catastrophically damaged aircraft for 90 minutes and 150 miles to safety. They achieved it through skill, determination, and teamwork. They did it without losing a single crew member. They did it in an aircraft that had no right to stay in the air, but somehow it did. Ralph Burbridge, the bombardier who spent his later years correcting the record, understood this. "The true story is amazing enough," he said in his final interview. "We don't need to make things up. What happened that day was impossible, but we did it anyway." That's the story that should be told. The 404th Bombardment Squadron flew 178 combat missions during World War II, losing 85 aircraft and hundreds of aircrew. Yet no single story matched All-American 3 for sheer improbability. The incident became a touchstone for the squadron, shaping its identity and pride. The squadron adopted a new emblem inspired by the event, a puppy praying atop a tail section. The choice of a puppy rather than a more martial symbol reflected the youth and vulnerability of the crew. Most were in their early 20s, but the praying stance also suggested hope and divine intervention, which many crew members sincerely believed had saved All-American 3. Decades later, veterans of the 414th would gather for reunions, and inevitably someone would retell the story of February 1st, 1943. Men who had survived their own harrowing missions would listen in awe to the tale of the bomber that refused to die. The encounter with the German fighter pilots also sparked rapid tactical and technical evolution in 1943. Early in the war, the Luftwaffe relied on light, maneuverable fighters with rifle-caliber machine guns optimized for dogfights. The arrival of heavy bombers like the B-17 forced a complete rethink. By mid-1943, partly due to incidents like All-American 3, German fighters were upgraded with heavier armament. The Bf-109 G6, introduced shortly after the Tunisia incident, carried a 30mm Mk108 cannon capable of firing explosive shells that could tear meter-wide holes in bomber structures. The F-190 was modified with multiple 20mm cannons and even 210mm rockets specifically for destroying bombers. Major Walter Nowotny, later one of the Luftwaffe's top bomber interceptors with 258 victories, wrote, "Each month the American bombers seemed to get tougher. We developed new tactics and weapons, and they responded with better defensive formations, improved armor, and longer-range escort fighters. It was a race we were slowly losing." The psychological effect on German pilots was severe. Young, often undertrained pilots were ordered to press attacks on heavily armed bomber formations, but approaching B-17s meant flying into converging streams of 50 caliber fire from multiple aircraft. As 1943 progressed, the survival rate for German fighter pilots declined sharply. The survival of All-American 3 was made possible not just by Boeing's design, but by an entire industrial network. The R-1820 Cyclone engines came from New Jersey and Ohio, the 50 caliber machine guns from Connecticut and Michigan, the aluminum skin from Tennessee and Washington, and instruments from dozens of specialized facilities nationwide. This distributed production meant no single raid or sabotage could stop B-17 production. It also allowed rapid improvements. Lessons learned in combat could be incorporated into new aircraft within weeks. The scale of American industrial mobilization was staggering. In 1939, the U.S. Army Air Corps had only 700 aircraft. By 1945, American factories had produced nearly 300,000 military planes. The B-17 program alone employed over 40,000 workers at Boeing's Seattle plant, operating 3 shifts around the clock. Beyond the technical marvels, the story of All-American 3 is fundamentally about 10 young men facing impossible odds. They were citizens answering their country's call, not professional soldiers. Bragg had been a college athlete and engineering student. Burbridge joined before Pearl Harbor simply because he wanted to fly. Their professionalism under catastrophic conditions reflects the excellence of American aircrew training. By 1943, the Army Air Forces had created the largest aerial training program in history, producing 100,000 new pilots annually, along with navigators, bombardiers, gunners, and other aircrew. Training emphasized technical skills, emergency procedures, and crew coordination. Crews learned each other's strengths and weaknesses over months of practice, building the teamwork that saved lives in combat. The All-American 3 crew had flown together long enough to trust each other completely, even while their aircraft was literally falling apart. While the survival of one bomber might seem tactically minor in a war with thousands of aircraft, the strategic impact was significant. The incident occurred when American daylight bombing doctrine was being tested. The idea that heavily armed bombers could reach targets without fighter escort was proving costly. Incidents like All-American 3 showed that B-17s could survive even severe damage, increasing the likelihood that experienced crews would finish their tours. This also affected German strategic thinking. If American bombers were difficult to destroy and American industry could produce them faster than Germany could shoot them down, the attrition math favored the Allies. This realization led to a shift in German production priorities from bombers to fighters, a change that ultimately could not stop the Allied advance. Despite extensive documentation, some aspects of All-American 3's survival remain subjects of engineering study. How did remaining structural members designed to carry perhaps 20% of the loads they endured hold for 90 minutes? Why didn't destructive aerodynamic flutter occur? The aircraft seems to have operated in a non-linear regime, where normal aerodynamic rules break down. Survival depended on the alignment of damage patterns, atmospheric conditions, and pilot skill, a near-perfect storm against overwhelming odds. In 1985, several surviving crew members reunited in Austin, Texas. Age had silvered their hair and slowed their steps, but before a B-17 on static display, the years fell away. They walked through the aircraft, each recalling their positions on that day 42 years earlier. Bragg, then 67, sat in the pilot's seat again, his hands automatically finding the control yoke. "She was a good ship," he said quietly. "She brought us home when she had every right to quit on us. You can't ask more than that from an airplane." Burbridge stood in the bombardier's position, pointing through the plexiglass. "That's where I saw the fighter coming straight at us. I can still see his face sometimes just before James got him." They signed autographs for aviation enthusiasts who had traveled to meet the men of All-American 3. They answered questions, posed for photographs, and shared memories of that impossible day. Yet there were also long pauses, moments when each man drifted back to Tunisia, remembering the aircraft shuddering from the impact, wondering if the next second would be their last. Military historians place the incident of All-American 3 in the larger scope of the air war over Europe and North Africa. It demonstrates both the strength of American bomber design and the courage of the young men who flew them. Survival in aerial combat depended on a combination of sound engineering, skilled piloting, and sometimes luck. The incident also shaped post-war aircraft design. The idea of redundancy, building aircraft that could survive battle damage, became central to military aviation. Modern combat aircraft continued to reflect lessons from the B-17, including multiple hydraulic systems, backup flight controls, and structural designs that prevent catastrophic failure from localized damage. The statistics of All-American 3's survival remain astonishing. 90 minutes of flight from collision to landing 150. My distance flown with catastrophic damage. 20,000 FT altitude at impact 10 crew. Members who all survived uninjured 0 FT distance. The tail section was barely attached 6 weeks. Time taken to repair and return her to service. One photograph capturing the impossible for history. 16 victories. Erich Paczia's combat record before the collision. Fundtumber 406, the serial number that should have appeared on a loss. Report these numbers tell a story of survival that defied all expectations, but was carefully documented and verified. Today, only a few B-17s remain airworthy, maintained by dedicated organizations that keep the legacy of the Flying Fortress alive. At air shows, veterans and aviation fans gather to see these aircraft, to hear the distinctive sound of the R-1820 Cyclone engines, and to remember, the story of All-American 3 is always told, often by someone connected to the original crew or by a historian who has studied the event in depth. Young spectators may be skeptical at first. Surely the story has been exaggerated. Then they see the photograph, read crew testimonies, and examine technical reports. Skepticism turns into amazement. The aircraft itself was scrapped in 1945 after giving everything it had, but her story endures, in museums, in books, and in the memories of the dwindling number of World War II veterans. She has become more than a plane. She symbolizes American industrial capability, aircrew courage, and the sometimes inexplicable nature of survival in war. In his final interview before his death in 2013, Bombardier Ralph Burbridge was asked what message he wanted to leave about All-American 3. He paused, then said, "We were just doing our job. That's what people today need to understand. We weren't heroes. We were young men far from home doing a job that needed doing. The airplane was built by people doing their job, building the best bomber they could. When we got hit, everyone did their job. Kenny flew. The gunners watched for fighters. I helped navigate." Sam crawled out of the tail. "The miracle wasn't that we survived. The miracle was that thousands of people, from the factory workers who built our plane to the ground crews who patched her up, did their jobs well enough that, when everything went wrong, we had a chance. That's the American way, everyone doing their part. And sometimes, when you need it most, it all comes together and works. We flew home in an airplane that couldn't fly, landed a plane that couldn't land, and walked away from what should have been our grave. If that isn't a miracle, I don't know what is." The story of All-American 3 goes beyond a simple combat narrative. It shows a moment when the impossible became possible, when engineering excellence met human determination. The 10 men who flew home on February 1, 1943, were carried not just by 4 R-1820 Cyclone engines and Boeing aluminum, but by the skill of American industry, the training of the Army Air Forces, and perhaps something more. Call it luck, fate, or divine intervention. Their survival proved that the B-17 Flying Fortress had earned its name, not through propaganda, but through demonstrated performance. For the Germans who saw it, the incident was a revelation. They were facing not just American aircraft, but American industrial power, training systems, and determination. For a Luftwaffe already stretched by attrition, All-American 3 was proof that the numbers would never work in their favor. The photograph from that day, a B-17 flying with its tail almost severed, has become one of World War II's most iconic images. It represents more than one miraculous survival. It captures the essence of the American air campaign, damaged but still flying, wounded but still returning home against all odds. Kendrick Bragg and his crew didn't set out to make history on February 1, 1943. They had a mission: bomb a target and return to base. But when disaster struck, a German fighter slicing their plane nearly in half, they responded with calm professionalism. They didn't panic. They didn't give up. Each man stayed at his position, trusting their training, their aircraft, and each other. In doing so, they created a story that would outlive them all, a testament to what is possible when engineering excellence meets human courage. The Germans were stunned when they saw the two aircraft collide, one dying and one damaged, yet flying together. Even more astonishing, the American bomber returned home against all laws of physics and probability. It was a preview of the industrial and military might that would eventually overwhelm the Third Reich. All-American 3 flew home on February 1, 1943, carrying 10 men who should have died but didn't in an aircraft that couldn't fly but did. She carried more than her crew, proof that American bombers were tougher than anyone imagined, that American air crews could rise to any challenge, and that sometimes in war's darkest moments, the impossible becomes possible. The tail section, which finally fell off after landing, unable to support even 3 curious ground crew members, had somehow held in flight for 90 minutes. It remains one of aviation's enduring mysteries, a reminder that human courage and determination can sometimes overcome even the laws of physics. Today, when engineers study the incident, when historians document it, when veterans recall it, the conclusion is the same: this shouldn't have been possible. Yet the photographs, testimonies, and official records all confirm that All-American 3 flew home when she should have fallen from the sky. In that impossibility lies the story's true meaning. When life and death hang in the balance, ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things. 10 young Americans in a broken airplane over hostile territory refused to accept defeat. In that refusal, in their determination to survive against impossible odds, they created a legend that will endure as long as World War II is remembered. The Germans watched in disbelief as 2 B-17s merged in a violent collision that should have destroyed both. Then they saw the American bomber, against all odds, fly home. They witnessed American engineering at its finest, air crews at their best, and determination at its most relentless. They witnessed the impossible.